Most people never see a tornado in their lifetime. And for those who do, the experience is almost always over in seconds. A wall of debris, a sound like a freight train, and then silence. But throughout American history, there have been tornadoes that didn't just pass through. They annihilated. They reshaped cities, erased towns from the map, and killed hundreds of people in a matter of minutes. Some of these storms struck during an era when meteorology was barely a science, and the only warning a person had was the color of the sky. Others struck in the age of Doppler radar and emergency alerts, and killed hundreds of people anyway. That gap between what we know and what we can still lose is what makes tornado history so haunting. The United States is the most tornado-prone country on Earth. No other nation experiences the frequency, the intensity, or the geographic range of tornadoes that strike America every single year. The collision of cold Arctic air from Canada, warm, moist air from the Gulf of Mexico, and dry air rolling off the Rocky Mountains creates a meteorological pressure cooker that has no equivalent anywhere else on the planet. Tornado Alley, that broad corridor running from Texas up through Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and into South Dakota, produces some of the world's most violent storms year after year. But Tornado Alley is only part of the story. Dixie Alley, stretching across Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Arkansas, produces tornadoes that are often more deadly per storm because they strike at night, move through dense vegetation that obscures them until the last moment, and hit communities with older housing stock that offers almost no protection against a direct hit.
Understanding why tornadoes kill the way they do requires understanding what a tornado actually is at its most extreme. An EF5 tornado, the highest classification on the enhanced Fujita scale, generates winds in excess of 320 kilometers per hour. At those speeds, wind stops behaving like air and starts behaving like a physical force that can strip the asphalt off a road, drive a piece of straw through a wooden beam, and lift a fully loaded freight car off its tracks. The pressure difference inside a large, violent tornado is so extreme that buildings don't simply collapse. They explode outward as the low-pressure core passes over them. People who survive direct hits from EF5 tornadoes often describe being pulled out of their homes and carried hundreds of meters before being set down, sometimes with nothing more than cuts and bruises, and sometimes not surviving at all. The randomness of who lives and who dies in a major tornado is one of the most psychologically disturbing aspects of these storms. A family sheltering in an interior bathroom survives, while their neighbors in a reinforced brick home across the street are killed. There is no clean logic to it. In today's video, we'll be counting down the 10 most dangerous tornadoes ever to strike the United States, examining not just the death tolls, but the human stories, the historical context, and the lasting changes each storm forced on American society. And to find our first entry, we're heading to the American South on a warm spring afternoon in 1953.
Waco, Texas, in the spring of 1953, was a city going about its ordinary business. It was a Monday afternoon. The weather was warm, and the streets of the downtown business district were full of people, running errands, shopping, working. Nobody was thinking about tornadoes. There was no reason to be thinking about tornadoes, because the warning systems that Americans now take for granted, the sirens, the weather radio alerts, the emergency broadcasts, the push notifications to their phones, did not exist in any meaningful form. In 1953, the word tornado was not even permitted to appear in official National Weather Service forecasts. The thinking among meteorologists and government officials at the time was that publicizing tornado warnings would cause mass panic, and that panic would kill more people than the storms themselves. It is one of the most catastrophic policy failures in American meteorological history. The tornado that dropped into downtown Waco that afternoon came without any official warning at all. It was an F5 storm by modern classification standards, and it descended directly onto the heart of the city's commercial center. The destruction was immediate and total. The R.H. Broyles Furniture Store, a massive 5-story building that dominated a city block, collapsed almost instantly. Inside were dozens of people who had seen the sky change and run inside seeking shelter.
believing, as most people did at the time, that a large concrete building was the safest place to be. It wasn't. The building came down on top of them, and the rescue operation that followed lasted for days as workers dug through rubble trying to reach people who were still alive underneath.
In the street outside, cars were thrown like toys. Storefronts were sheared off their foundations. Telephone poles snapped and became projectiles. One of the most haunting photographs from the Waco disaster shows a downtown street so completely stripped of its buildings that it looks like a bomb site, with only the occasional chimney or partial wall remaining to indicate that an entire commercial district had been there an hour before. 114 people were killed, and over 600 were injured. For a city of Waco's size, those numbers represented a community-altering catastrophe. The aftermath of the Waco tornado set off a chain of events that would change American meteorology forever. Researchers and forecasters who had been pushing against the prohibition on tornado warnings finally had the political leverage they needed. Within months, the National Weather Service began issuing experimental tornado watches and warnings in parts of Texas and Oklahoma. By the mid-1950s, the modern tornado warning system was taking shape. The people who died in Waco in 1953 helped create a structure that has saved countless American lives in the decades since. That legacy doesn't diminish the tragedy, but it gives it a weight and a meaning that keeps the Waco tornado in the historical record far beyond what its rank on this list might suggest. The Waco tornado takes the 10th place spot, and for our next entry, we're heading to the Midwest, where just weeks after Waco, another catastrophic storm would strike. 1953 was one of the deadliest tornado years in American history, and the reason comes down to the same fundamental problem that killed people in Waco, a warning system that didn't work. The Flint Beecher tornado struck Michigan less than a month after the Waco disaster, and in a dark historical coincidence, the lessons of Waco had not yet been implemented anywhere. The communities north of Flint had no warning, no sirens, and no expectation that a storm of this magnitude was possible in Michigan. Tornadoes, in the popular imagination of the time, were a Great Plains phenomenon. They happened in Texas and Oklahoma, not in the industrial Midwest. That belief was catastrophically wrong. The tornado that struck the Beecher community on the evening of June 8th was an F5 storm, the most violent classification possible. Beecher was a working-class suburb, a neighborhood of small, wood-frame houses packed closely together on modest lots. Families were home for the evening. Children were playing outside. The sky went green, the air pressure dropped, and then the tornado was there. Witnesses described a wall of destruction moving through the neighborhood so quickly that there was no time to react, no time to run, no time to do anything except experience it. The tornado stayed on the ground for approximately 25 kilometers and was at some points over 800 meters wide. In the Beecher community specifically, entire streets were stripped to their foundations. Houses that had stood for 30 years were reduced to splinters in seconds. The debris fields stretched for kilometers in every direction, and in the immediate aftermath, survivors stumbled through their demolished neighborhood, unable to recognize streets they had walked every day of their lives. The landscape had been so completely transformed that landmarks had ceased to exist. 116 people were killed, making it the deadliest Michigan tornado ever recorded. That record stands to this day, more than 70 years later. Over 340 people were injured, many of them severely, and hundreds of families were left with nothing. The community of Beecher never fully recovered its pre-storm character. The physical reconstruction happened, slowly and imperfectly, but the social fabric of the neighborhood, the particular constellation of families and relationships that had defined it, was permanently altered. Generational trauma from events like the Flint Beecher tornado tends to linger in communities for decades, shaping how people talk about weather, how they respond to dark skies, and how deep the anxiety runs when tornado season begins each spring. The Flint Beecher tornado takes the 9th place spot, and for our next entry, we're going much further back in time, to an era when the American frontier was still being shaped. To understand the Natchez tornado, you have to understand what Natchez, Mississippi was in 1840. It was one of the wealthiest cities in the American South, a hub of the cotton trade, sitting on the bluffs above the Mississippi River. The river itself was the economic artery of the region, and on any given day, dozens of flatboats, keelboats, and steamboats were moored along the landing below the bluffs, loaded with goods and people moving up and down the continent's great waterway. The landing was busy, crowded, and completely exposed to the open sky. On May 7th, 1840, a massive tornado crossed the Mississippi River and struck the Natchez Landing with catastrophic force. The timing could not have been worse. The landing was full of boats and the people on them, traders, laborers, travelers, and families, and the tornado destroyed nearly every vessel in its path. Boats were capsized, torn apart, or hurled onto the shore. People who jumped into the river to escape the storm drowned in the churning water. The tornado then moved up the bluff and into the city itself, demolishing homes and businesses along its path. The official death toll was recorded at 317 people, but historians have consistently argued that the true number was significantly higher. The reason is a grim one. A large proportion of the people on those boats and in the surrounding areas were enslaved individuals, whose deaths were systematically undercounted or simply not recorded at all by the white authorities who compiled the casualty figures. When researchers have attempted to reconstruct the actual death toll based on contemporaneous accounts, the estimates climb well above 400, and some place it higher still. The Natchez tornado may well be the deadliest single tornado in American history, but the full truth of it was buried along with the people whose lives were considered not worth counting. The destruction in the city itself was extensive, with over 300 buildings damaged or destroyed. The economic disruption to Natchez's trading infrastructure lasted for years. And yet, because this was 1840, there was no national response, no federal disaster relief, and no systematic effort to understand what had happened meteorologically. The storm was recorded in newspapers, mourned in churches, and then largely forgotten in the way that disasters tend to be forgotten when they strike communities without political power. The Natchez tornado takes the 8th place spot, and for our next entry, we're moving into the 20th century and heading to the vast open plains of the Texas and Oklahoma Panhandle. The Texas and Oklahoma Panhandle in the late 1940s was a landscape still scarred by the Dust Bowl. The farming communities that stretched across those flat, open miles had already endured a decade of ecological disaster, economic ruin, and mass outmigration. The people who remained were, by necessity, tough and resilient. They had survived things that had driven their neighbors away. But nothing in the Dust Bowl years had prepared them for what arrived on the evening of April 9th, 1947. The Glazier-Higgins-Woodward tornado system was not a single twister, but a family of violent tornadoes spawned by the same supercell thunderstorm, and it traveled hundreds of kilometers across open country before slamming into populated areas with devastating force. The town of Glazier, Texas was the first to be hit, and it was effectively destroyed. The small community of Higgins, Texas was next, suffering severe damage. But the worst was yet to come. Woodward, Oklahoma bore the full fury of the system's most powerful tornado. Woodward was a small city of about 5,000 people, a regional center for the surrounding agricultural communities. And on the evening of April 9th, many residents were at home, eating dinner or preparing for bed. The tornado arrived at night, which amplified the terror and the chaos. People who might have seen a daytime storm approaching had no visual warning at all. The sound was often the first indication, that infamous freight train roar, and by the time it registered, the storm was already there. The tornado cut a swath through Woodward that was in some places nearly a kilometer wide. Over 100 city blocks were leveled. The destruction was so complete and so indiscriminate that it defied easy comprehension. Homes, churches, schools, the local hospital, all of it went. Survivors described emerging from their hiding spots to find that the streets they had lived on their entire lives simply no longer existed. Everything that had given the landscape its familiar character was gone, replaced by a flat field of rubble under a suddenly silent sky. 107 people died in Woodward alone.
Across the full path of the storm system, the death toll reached 181. Over 1,000 people were injured, and thousands more were left homeless at a time when federal disaster relief was limited, and the burden of recovery fell almost entirely on the community itself and on neighboring towns.
April 1936 was a month that the American South would never forget, and the Tupelo tornado was a small city in the northeastern corner of the state, a textile and manufacturing town surrounded by the rolling farmland of the Deep South. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the communities in and around Tupelo were going about their weekend routines, largely unaware of the severe weather that meteorologists, such as they were in 1936, had identified moving through the region. The tornado that struck Tupelo on April 5th was one of the most violent in Mississippi history. Wind speed estimates have placed it firmly in the F5 range, and the width of the damage path confirmed that this was a large, mature tornado at the peak of its destructive power. It moved through residential neighborhoods in the northern part of the city with a ferocity that left survivors struggling to find words for what they had seen. Houses didn't just collapse, they were atomized, reduced to collections of splinters and shards that bore almost no resemblance to the structures they had been. In some blocks, the only indication that homes had stood there was the concrete steps leading up to where the front door had been.
Over 200 people were killed, and more than 1,000 were injured. The scale of the casualties overwhelmed Tupelo's medical infrastructure almost immediately. Schools and churches were converted into field hospitals. Doctors and nurses worked through the night and into the following days, treating injuries ranging from cuts and broken bones to traumatic brain injuries and crush wounds from falling debris. The National Red Cross mobilized one of its largest relief operations to that point, and Tupelo became a focal point for the country's attention for weeks afterward. The storm carries a historical footnote that has become perhaps its most widely known detail in popular culture. Among the survivors was a 1-year-old boy named Elvis Aaron Presley. His family home, a small 2-room shotgun house on Old Saltillo Road, was destroyed in the tornado. Elvis and his parents survived. The house did not. Whether this early brush with catastrophe shaped anything about the man Elvis became is impossible to say, but the detail has given the Tupelo tornado a strange cultural permanence that pure death toll statistics alone never could. The Tupelo tornado takes the 6th place spot, and for our next entry, we don't have to travel far in time or geography because the very next day brought another catastrophe.
24 hours after Tupelo, a storm struck Gainesville, Georgia, that was, in many ways, even more meteorologically extraordinary. The Gainesville tornado was actually 2 separate tornadoes that converged on the city at the same moment, a rare and almost incomprehensible event that doubled the destruction in a way that a single storm, no matter how powerful, could not have replicated. The 2 funnels were products of the same parent supercell, and as they moved toward the city from slightly different angles, they merged just as they reached the populated downtown area. Gainesville in 1936 was a small industrial city of about 10,000 people, situated in the foothills of northern Georgia. It was a Monday morning, and the city was already busy with the workday. The Cooper Pants Factory, a large textile manufacturing plant in the downtown area, was running its morning shift. Hundreds of workers, predominantly women, many of them the primary breadwinners for their families, were at their sewing stations when the tornado arrived. The factory was a large brick building, and in the thinking of the time, that should have made it one of the safer places in the city. It wasn't. The combined energy of 2 converging tornadoes was more than the structure could withstand, and the building collapsed catastrophically, trapping hundreds of workers beneath the rubble. The rescue operation that followed was one of the most desperate in Georgia history. Workers from across the city descended on the ruins with their bare hands and whatever tools they could find, pulling survivors from the debris, while the smell of gas leaks and the sound of groaning structural steel made every moment potentially more dangerous.
203 people were killed in the Gainesville tornado, and the Cooper Pants Factory accounted for a devastating proportion of those deaths. The image of that collapsed building and of the women who worked inside it became one of the defining visual symbols of 1930s tornado tragedy. In the days that followed, President Franklin Roosevelt sent personal messages of condolence, and federal relief efforts were dispatched to both Gainesville and Tupelo, marking one of the early uses of federal government resources in response to a natural disaster of this type. The recovery in Gainesville was long and painful. Rebuilding the physical city took years. Rebuilding the community, restoring the sense of safety and normalcy that the tornado had destroyed, took much longer. There are families in Gainesville today whose great-grandparents survived that morning, and for whom April 6, 1936 remains a date of quiet, private significance. The Gainesville tornado takes the 5th place spot, and for our next entry, we're moving to a storm that redefined what Americans thought a tornado could do.
There are superlatives attached to the tri-state tornado that no other storm in American history can claim, and that is why, despite ranking 4th on this list, it is in many ways the defining tornado event in the national record. On March 18, 1925, a tornado touched down in southeastern Missouri, and then did something that meteorologists still find extraordinary when they study it. It stayed on the ground. For 3.5 hours, across a path of 352 kilometers, the tri-state tornado traveled through 3 states without lifting. It is the longest continuous tornado track ever recorded in the United States. It is the longest in the world. The speed at which it moved made it uniquely lethal. Most tornadoes travel at between 30 and 60 kilometers per hour, which gives people at least some time to react once the storm is visible. The tri-state tornado moved at an average forward speed of nearly 100 kilometers per hour. At times, it moved even faster than that. Communities in its path had minutes at most. Many had seconds. And because the tornado was wrapped in heavy rain and low cloud cover, it was often invisible until it was directly overhead. People didn't see it coming. They simply heard it, and then it was there. The storm crossed southeastern Missouri with devastating effect, destroying the town of Annapolis and numerous smaller communities before crossing into Illinois. In Illinois, it found the densely populated mining communities of the southern part of the state, and the death toll exploded. The town of Murfreesboro, Illinois, lost 234 people, the highest death toll for any single community from any single tornado in American history. The town of DeSoto lost 69 people, 33 of them children who were in school when the tornado struck. The school was destroyed completely, and the image of those children's deaths became a catalyst for early conversations about tornado shelters and public buildings. The town of West Frankfort lost 148 people. By the time the tornado crossed into Indiana and finally lifted near the town of Princeton, it had traveled further, stayed on the ground longer, and killed more people than any tornado before or since in recorded. The total death toll was 695 people. More than 2,000 were injured. 15,000 people were left homeless across 3 states. The economic damage, calculated in 1925 dollars, was staggering. The psychological damage was incalculable. Entire communities were functionally destroyed, and the recovery process unfolded without any federal disaster relief infrastructure, because such a thing barely existed yet. Churches, volunteer organizations, and neighboring communities carried almost the entire weight of the response. What the tri-state tornado revealed, brutally and undeniably, was that a tornado could be far larger, far faster, and far more sustained than anyone had previously believed possible. The meteorological community was forced to confront the limits of its understanding, and the public was forced to confront the fact that certain acts of weather occupied a category beyond ordinary disaster. The tri-state tornado was not a storm. It was an event, and it still is. The tri-state tornado takes the 4th place spot, and for our next entry, we're moving nearly a century forward to a disaster that shocked a country that believed it had learned all the lessons the previous century had to teach. By 2011, America believed, reasonably, based on the evidence, that it had largely solved the problem of tornado casualties. The death tolls from major tornadoes had fallen dramatically over the decades as warning systems improved, as Doppler radar became standard, and as emergency management agencies developed increasingly sophisticated response protocols. The average lead time for a tornado warning in 2011 was around 13 minutes, compared to essentially 0 in 1953.
People had phones that could receive emergency alerts. Weather apps were ubiquitous. The National Weather Service had become a world-class meteorological institution. The tools were extraordinary. And then Joplin happened. On the evening of May 22, 2011, a massive EF5 tornado dropped out of a supercell thunderstorm southwest of Joplin, Missouri, and moved directly through the heart of the city. Joplin was not a small town. It was a city of over 50,000 people, with established neighborhoods, a regional hospital, shopping centers, schools, and all the infrastructure of modern American urban life. A tornado warning had been issued 16 minutes before the storm struck. The sirens had sounded. People knew it was coming. 158 people were killed anyway. The tornado was over a mile wide at its peak. Its winds exceeded 320 kilometers per hour. It moved through Joplin on a nearly perfect east-west track that took it through densely populated residential areas, through commercial strips, and directly over St. John.
A 6-story hospital that was gutted so completely that only the structural frame remained. Inside the hospital, staff worked desperately to move patients away from windows and into interior hallways as the tornado dismantled the building around them. Patients on ventilators lost power, surgical suites filled with debris. Doctors and nurses shielded patients with their own bodies. Several people died inside the hospital, and the building itself had to be demolished and rebuilt. In the residential neighborhoods, the destruction was absolute. Entire subdivisions were stripped to their concrete slabs. Mature trees were not just knocked down, but debarked, the bark torn from the wood by the force of the wind, which tornado researchers noted as a marker of extreme violence. Cars were carried hundreds of meters and deposited in fields. People who had taken shelter in bathtubs, in closets, in basement stairwells survived. People who had been a few meters further from safety did not. The randomness was, once again, one of the most psychologically devastating aspects of the aftermath. The Joplin tornado forced an immediate and urgent reassessment of American tornado preparedness. The 16-minute warning had not been enough because millions of Americans, conditioned by years of false alarms and uneventful storms, had developed what researchers called warning fatigue, a tendency to wait and see rather than act immediately when a warning sounds. Studies conducted after Joplin found that many victims had heard the sirens and had time to seek shelter, but had chosen to look out the window first, to check their phone, to wait for a confirmation that never came. The storm exposed a gap not in technology, but in humans. St. Louis in 1896 was one of the most important cities in the United States. It was the 4th largest city in the country, a booming industrial and commercial center with a population approaching 500,000 people, a gateway to the West, and a city confident in its own importance and permanence. It had beautiful parks, grand civic buildings, wealthy residential neighborhoods, and a thriving working-class population packed into dense neighborhoods along the riverfront. It was, by every measure, a major American metropolis. And on the evening of May 27, 1896, a tornado walked straight through it. The St. Louis tornado crossed the Mississippi River from East St. Louis, where it had already killed dozens of people and destroyed hundreds of structures, and entered the city itself with winds that modern researchers have estimated exceeded 300 kilometers per hour. The storm moved through a broad swath of the city, on a path that cut diagonally from the river through some of the most densely populated neighborhoods on the south side. The destruction it produced was the kind that in 1896 seemed almost beyond comprehension. Brick buildings that had stood for decades were demolished as though they were made of paper. Rooftops were torn off and carried for city blocks before descending on new targets. The iron bridges spanning the Mississippi were damaged. Steamboats moored at the levee were sunk. 255 people were killed. More than 1,000 were injured. Thousands more were left homeless as hundreds of buildings were destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. What made the St. Louis... In the immediate aftermath, the scale of the devastation was so enormous that city officials struggled to coordinate a response. The dead were laid out in improvised morgues. The injured overwhelmed the city's hospitals.
In the poorest neighborhoods, where wooden tenement buildings had offered almost no structural protection, entire blocks were simply gone. Was tornado so significant in the historical record, beyond the human cost, was what it demonstrated about the vulnerability of urban America. The country had, up to that point, tended to think of tornado disasters as rural events, tragedies that struck farms and small towns, not great cities. St. Louis proved that wrong in the most dramatic way possible. A tornado did not respect city limits or civic grandeur. It did not distinguish between a modest farmhouse in Oklahoma and a brownstone in one of America's leading cities. The laws of meteorology applied equally everywhere, and the people of St. Louis in 1896 learned that lesson at an enormous cost. The St. Louis tornado takes the second place spot. And for our final entry, we're not looking at a single tornado, but at a day and a night that permanently changed the way the United States understands what weather can do.
There are tornado events, and then there are days that redefine the entire category. The super outbreak of April 3rd and 4th, 1974 falls into the second group so decisively that it stands apart from everything else in American tornado history, including many of the storms that have appeared on this list. In a 24-hour period spanning from the early afternoon of April 3rd to the pre-dawn hours of April 4th, 148 confirmed tornadoes touched down across 13 states. From Alabama to Michigan, from Mississippi to Ohio, simultaneous supercell thunderstorms produced tornado after tornado in a display of atmospheric violence that had no precedent in the historical record. The scale of it was simply not something the American weather community had seen before. Meteorologists working at the Storm Prediction Center, then known as the National Severe Storms Forecast Center, watched the radar returns with a kind of stunned disbelief. They had never tracked this many significant tornadoes at once. The warning system was overwhelmed not by failure, but by volume. There were too many storms happening in too many places, too fast for any centralized response to keep pace. The tornadoes struck across an enormous geographic range, and some of them were monsters. 30 of the 148 tornadoes were rated F4 or F5, the two highest categories of tornado intensity. 6 of them were rated F5. To put that in perspective, the United States averages roughly one F5 tornado per year. On April 3rd and 4th, 1974, 6 of them occurred within the same 24-hour period.
Xenia, Ohio, was one of the hardest-hit communities. The F5 tornado that struck Xenia cut a path directly through the center of town, destroying over 1,000 homes, demolishing the high school, and killing 34 people. Survivors described looking up and seeing cars and houses and pieces of other buildings rotating in the funnel above them. The tornado was wide enough and violent enough that people in the path had essentially no survivable options except pure luck and abasement. Xenia became the symbol of the super outbreak in the national media, the image of a small Midwestern city comprehensively destroyed by a force it had no ability to resist. In Alabama, the outbreak killed over 100 people across multiple storm tracks. The town of Gwinn was struck by an F5 that remains one of the most violent tornadoes in Alabama history. Communities across the northern part of the state were hit repeatedly as storm after storm dropped out of the supercells rolling through the region. Families who survived one tornado emerged to find that another was already forming to the west. The psychological burden of that, of surviving and then having to face the same threat again within hours, produced a kind of trauma that researchers would study for years afterward. In Kentucky, the town of Brandenburg was struck by an F5 that killed 31 people in a community of fewer than 2,000 residents. That is a per capita death rate that is difficult to comprehend. Nearly every family in Brandenburg lost someone, or knew someone who did, or lived next door to a house that was no longer there. The collective grief of a community that small, absorbing that kind of loss, is not something that can be adequately expressed in statistics. In Tennessee, in Georgia, in Indiana, in Virginia, the outbreak reached into states that were not accustomed to thinking of themselves as tornado country, and it killed people there too. The total death toll across the 24-hour outbreak was 330 people. More than 5,000 were injured. The economic damage, calculated in 1974 dollars, exceeded $500 million. In current terms, the damage would run into the billions. But the number that matters most when assessing the legacy of the super outbreak is not the death toll or the dollar figure. The number that matters is what came after. In the years following April 3rd and 4th, 1974, the United States fundamentally rebuilt its approach to tornado meteorology and emergency management. The National Weather Service was reorganized. Investment in Doppler radar technology accelerated dramatically, leading eventually to the national NEXRAD radar network that covers the entire country. The Fujita scale, which had been introduced only in 1971, was refined and eventually replaced with the enhanced Fujita scale, based in part on damage analysis from super outbreak storms. Public emergency management infrastructure was strengthened at the federal, state, and local levels. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, which was created in 1979, owes a significant part of its political origin to the recognition, forced by the super outbreak, that natural disasters of this scope required a coordinated national response, rather than a patchwork of local efforts.
Every American who has ever received a tornado warning on their phone, every student who has ever practiced a tornado drill in school, every family who knows which room of their house to go to when the sirens sound, all of them are living in a system that was shaped in no small part by what happened on April 3rd and 4th, 1974. The super outbreak did not just kill 330 people and injure 5,000 more. It changed the country. No single tornado event in American history has had a greater combined impact in immediate human cost, in geographic reach, in meteorological significance, and in the lasting transformation it forced on how the United States prepares for, responds to, and recovers from the most violent weather on Earth. The super outbreak of 1974 takes the #1 spot, and it is not close.